Daniel West signed the divorce papers with the same hand that had once held his wife's hair, back during hospital nights, fixed her father's broken office generator in a storm, and written quiet checks nobody in the Vale family ever thanked him for. He signed on the last line, placed the pen down gently, and did not look at Marissa when the lawyer slid the document away. The conference room on the second floor of the courthouse was too bright, too polished, too clean for something that felt like a burial. Across the table, Marissa Vale sat in a cream designer coat with her mother beside her, and her attorney behind her shoulder, all of them looking relieved in the way people look relieved when they think they have removed a stain. "Well," Marissa said, folding her hands over her purse, "I hope you keep the truck. It suits you." Her mother Celeste gave a small laugh that she tried to hide as a cough. "At least he will have somewhere to sleep if consulting dries up." Daniel heard it. Everyone heard it. Even Marissa's attorney looked down at his papers, pretending to review a clause that no longer mattered. Daniel did not answer. He had learned over 7 years of marriage that some insults were not meant to start a conversation. They were meant to measure how much dignity you had left. Marissa leaned back in her chair, studying him as if he were already part of a life she had outgrown. "You never fought for anything, Daniel. Not really. You just accepted whatever happened. My father was right. Some men are steady because they are strong. Others are steady because they have nowhere to go." Daniel looked at the gold ring on his finger. It had been simple when they bought it because simple was all he could afford after selling stock options to keep her family's company from missing payroll. She had never known that part. Or maybe she had chosen not to remember. He turned the ring once slowly, then removed it and placed it in his coat pocket. Marissa waited for him to defend himself, to say he had loved her, to say he had given up a career. To say the years when she called him unambitious were the same years he had been paying specialists covering silent debts and keeping promises her family treated like inconvenience. But Daniel knew something about rooms like this. When people had already written your character in ink, every defense only looked like begging. He stood, folded his copy of the divorce papers once, and slipped them under his arm. "That's it?" Marissa asked. Daniel buttoned his old navy suit jacket. It was clean, but the cuffs were worn. "That's it? You're not even going to say anything?" He looked at her, then not coldly, not cruelly, only with the exhausted clarity of a man who had finally stopped carrying a door that no longer led anywhere. "You made your choice in a room full of witnesses. I don't need to decorate it with words." Then he walked out. The courthouse hallway was crowded with people waiting for their own versions of loss. A father arguing over custody, a young woman crying near the elevator, a bailiff giving directions to someone who looked too frightened to understand them. Daniel moved through it all without hurry. Behind him, the Vale family followed at a distance, their shoes clicking against marble. Celeste spoke loudly enough for him to hear. "He will be renting a room by Friday." Marissa did not correct her. Outside, the morning air smelled like rain on concrete. Daniel stepped down from the courthouse entrance and stood near the curb with the divorce papers in one hand and his left hand empty for the first time in 7 years. Across the street, his old pickup sat beneath a parking meter with a dent in the rear fender and a toolbox in the bed. He had planned to drive away in its stop at a diner outside town and sit with a cup of black coffee until the first wave of grief passed. Marissa came out behind him with her mother, father, and attorney. Richard Vale, tall and silver-haired, adjusted his cufflinks and looked at Daniel's truck with open contempt. "I suppose this is where we say good luck." Daniel nodded once. Richard's smile sharpened. "Try not to make this more embarrassing than it already is." Daniel turned toward the crosswalk. That was when the black limousine pulled up. It did not screech to a stop or announce itself with drama. It glided to the curb with the quiet weight of expensive machinery. Long, polished, black as deep water with tinted windows and a small silver W on the front plate. The driver stepped out in a charcoal suit and opened the rear door before anyone asked who it was for. A woman in her 50s emerged from the front passenger side holding a leather folder against her chest. Daniel stopped walking. Marissa's smile faded. Celeste stopped whispering. Richard Vale looked at the limo, then at the courthouse, then back at Daniel as if searching for a more important man standing nearby. The woman approached Daniel directly. "Mr. West," she said. "Clara Bennett. Chairman Whitmore is waiting." The silence on the courthouse steps changed shape. Daniel closed his eyes for half a second, not surprised exactly, but tired. "I told Arthur I might not be available until noon. He said you would say that." Clara glanced at her watch. The emergency board session was moved up. "He asked me to apologize for the timing." Richard Vale stepped forward. "Whitmore, Arthur Whitmore." Clara looked at him with professional neutrality. "Yes." Marissa's eyes moved from Clara to Daniel. "Daniel, what is this?" For the first time that morning, Daniel almost smiled. Not because he enjoyed her confusion, because after years of being asked to explain his worth to people who preferred not to hear it, the question had finally arrived too late. "It's a ride," he said. Clara opened the rear door wider. Inside, the limo was quiet, dark, and waiting. Daniel slipped the divorce papers into his coat, walked past Marissa, and got in without another word. As the door closed, he saw her standing on the courthouse steps with the same expression she used to wear when a luxury store clerk recognized someone richer behind her. Only this time, the door had opened for him. The limo moved through downtown traffic while rain began to gather on the windshield. Clara sat across from Daniel and opened the leather folder. "The chairman is on a secure line. He wanted to speak before you arrive." A screen lit up from the side panel and Arthur Whitmore appeared with white hair, a lined face, and eyes that had spent 72 years learning which men lied because they were afraid and which lied because they enjoyed it. Behind him was the corner of a boardroom Daniel had not seen in 5 years. "Daniel," Arthur said. "I am sorry about the courthouse." Daniel looked out the window. The city slid by in gray reflections. "You sent a limousine to my divorce. I sent a limousine to a man who told me he would not discuss business until his marriage was legally finished. Your timing was yours. The board's crisis is mine." Daniel leaned back. "Arthur, I told you last month I wasn't coming back. You told me that before Owen Pierce tried to push harbor expansion through final approval with half the safeguards missing." Daniel's eyes shifted back to the screen. Arthur saw it. "There he is. I don't work for Whitmore anymore." "No," Arthur said. "But HarborLink still has your bones in it. And if my people are about to sign a $400 million rollout built on a polished version of your old model, I want the man who built the ugly version in the room." Daniel's hand moved toward his pocket where the wedding ring rested beside an old Whitmore keycard he had never thrown away. The plastic card had expired years ago, but he kept it for reasons he did not examine too closely. Once that card had opened, secure operations, floors, cold dispatch rooms, port warehouses, and late-night meetings where Daniel had been the youngest person at the table, and often the only one willing to tell executives their beautiful plan would fail on a wet Tuesday. "Why now?" Daniel asked. Arthur's jaw tightened. "Because Owen says the manual fail-safes were inefficient. Because the board likes clean projections. Because the new system makes the expansion look profitable by the second quarter. And because Naomi Reed found an old red flag memo with your name on it." Daniel looked down. "What date?" "March 2021. He remembered it immediately. Harbor delay convergence, driver hour compression, cold chain load stacking. He had written it 2 weeks before Marissa's diagnosis turned serious, before doctors and bills and family meetings swallowed every hour he used to give Whitmore. He had warned that the model could run beautifully under normal conditions and collapse when 3 pressures hit together. Not one crisis, a convergence. "I told the team not to scale without the local override layer," Daniel said. "They removed it." "Of course they did." Arthur's voice softened. "You left before I could fight for you." Daniel said nothing. That was true but incomplete. He had left Whitmore in 2021 because Marissa needed treatment, and Richard Vale needed money, and Celeste needed someone to blame quietly for the family's embarrassment. Daniel had been offered a senior operations role that year, maybe more. Instead, he negotiated a leave, then resigned, then sold stock options at the worst possible time because Vale and Co. Development was days away from defaulting on a bridge loan that would have ruined Marissa's family name. Richard called it temporary assistance. Celeste called it family loyalty. Marissa called it a rough year. None of them called it sacrifice. When Marissa recovered, she did not see the man who had stayed. She saw the title he no longer had. She saw the pickup truck, the consulting invoices, the dinners he cooked because clients were uncertain and her career was rising. She saw what was missing, not what had been spent to keep her standing. Arthur watched Daniel's face through the screen. "I know more than you think." "I doubt that. I know you sold Whitmore stock to cover a Vale debt position. I know you refused to let our finance department report it because you said it was personal. I know you turned down my offer to return twice because your wife did not want people to think she needed your old employer's charity." Daniel looked sharply at Clara. She did not react. Arthur continued, "I also know your ex-father-in-law is attached to the warehouse property package for harbor expansion. That is why I need you clear-eyed today." Daniel gave a low laugh without humor. "My divorce was final 12 minutes ago." "Then congratulations," Arthur said. "You are legally free to tell the truth without protecting people who stopped protecting you." The limo turned toward Whitmore Tower, a glass and steel building rising above the financial district. Daniel had not entered it since the day he packed one cardboard box and left his badge on a desk. When the limo stopped at the private entrance, Clara stepped out first. The doorman took one look at Daniel's worn suit and hesitated only until Clara said chairman's guest. Those two words opened doors faster than wealth ever had for him. Inside the executive elevator, Daniel slipped the old keycard from his wallet. The corner was cracked. The photo showed a younger version of him with less gray at the temples and more certainty in his eyes. Clara noticed. "You kept it," Habit Daniel said. "No," Clara said, looking at the card. "People keep things when they never fully leave." The boardroom doors opened on the 44th floor. 12 people sat around a long black table with screens covering one wall in port maps, route models, warehouse nodes, delivery windows, and projected revenue curves. Arthur Whitmore sat at the head of the table. Owen Pierce, the interim COO, stood near the display with the bright confidence of a man who had never met a model he could not simplify into a bonus. Owen looked at Daniel's suit, then at Clara, then back at Daniel. "This is the emergency expert." Naomi Reed, a board member with silver-streaked hair and a reputation for remembering everything, looked up from a folder. Her face changed. "Daniel West." Owen raised an eyebrow. "The consultant from 5 years ago." Daniel placed the old keycard on the table. "Employee before that." Owen gave a thin smile. "Of course. Well, I appreciate the nostalgia, but we have a limited window. Harbor expansion has been reviewed by current leadership, current analysts, and current software teams." Arthur folded his hands. "And now it will be reviewed by the man who built the contingency logic your team removed." Owen's smile held, but barely. "With respect, Chairman, the old HarborLink model was conservative. We removed unnecessary manual friction." Daniel looked at the route map. "You removed the part that knew drivers were human." That landed badly. A few board members shifted. Owen turned toward the screen. "The new model accounts for driver hour rules, port delays, fuel variance, cold chain priority, and warehouse staging." Separately, Daniel said. Owen blinked. "Excuse me. You tested them separately." The boardroom quieted by 1 degree. Daniel walked to the display, not asking permission. He pointed to a cluster of routes around the East Harbor distribution corridor. "Your projections assume the cold chain loads can be reprioritized after a port delay without compressing driver hours into the return window. That works if only the port is late. It works if only the refrigeration loads stack. It works if only drivers hit their hour limits. But when all three happen together, your automated system pushes the same pool of drivers toward the same warehouse lanes within a 6-hour window." Owen crossed his arms. "We ran stress tests. On clean data. Our data came from the last 18 months, which excluded 2 strike advisories, a flood detour, and the holiday cold chain surge because someone labeled them outliers." Daniel turned to the analyst at the side table. "Pull the February 2021 simulation." HarborLink read memo. The analyst looked at Owen. Arthur said, "Pull it." Keys clicked. Files opened. A memo appeared on the wall, old formatting plain titled Daniel's name in the author line. "Harbor Delay Convergence Risk Manual Override Required Before Scale." Naomi Reed leaned forward. "I remember this," she said. "You warned that the model would look profitable until the first real convergence event." Daniel nodded. "Because average conditions hide compound failure. Roads don't fail in averages." Owen's jaw tightened. "The current software uses adaptive routing. Adaptive routing cannot assign a legal hour to a driver who has already used it. It cannot turn a warm loading bay into a cold one. It cannot make a late port unload earlier because the quarterly projection needs it to." Daniel tapped the screen. "Your system will start by delaying low-margin freight. Then it will bump contract windows. Then cold chain penalties hit. Then drivers refuse impossible dispatch. And when you patch it manually, you will discover the manual layer was removed to make the rollout look cleaner." For a moment, the room said nothing. Arthur looked at Owen. "Is the manual override layer removed?" Owen looked toward his CTO, who looked toward the table. "It was deprecated." Naomi's voice sharpened. "That is not an answer." The CTO swallowed. "Yes, it was removed from the active rollout environment." Silence spread across the boardroom. It was not the stunned silence from the courthouse where people saw a limo and did not understand what it meant. This was deeper. This was the silence of professionals watching a beautiful plan reveal the crack under its paint. Arthur turned back to Daniel. "Can it be restored?" "Not by Friday." Owen seized on that. "Then delaying the vote could cost us the expansion window." "Approving the vote could cost you the company," Daniel said. Owen's face reddened. "That is dramatic." "No," Daniel said. "Dramatic is pretending a model works because the graph is smooth." Naomi opened the red flag memo in her folder. Daniel, your 2021 recommendation said any expansion tied to the East Harbor corridor needed local dispatch authority and property flexibility. What changed in this proposal? Daniel looked at the map. He pointed to one warehouse node highlighted in blue. That facility. Arthur's eyes narrowed. Vale & Co. Development. Daniel did not look away from the screen. Yes. Owen said quickly, Vale's site gives us tax advantages and proximity. It also forces the cold chain staging into a single corridor with no overflow lane. The original plan used 2 smaller sites and local dispatch authority. This plan uses one Vale property and automated routing to justify it. Naomi looked toward Arthur. Conflict exposure. Potentially, Daniel said. If Vale's financials depend on this contract closing and the model was adjusted to support that site, the board needs to know who pushed the assumption change. Arthur's gaze moved to Owen. Owen raised both hands. This is speculation from a former employee who clearly has personal issues with the Vale family. Daniel thought of Marissa on the courthouse steps, asking, "What is this?" as the limo door opened. He thought of Celeste, saying he would rent a room by Friday. He thought of Richard Vale's polished contempt. Then he looked at the board. My personal life ended in court this morning, he said. This is math. No one spoke. Arthur leaned back slowly, and the old billionaire's expression changed from concern to decision. We pause the approval vote until Daniel completes an independent failure review. Owen's eyes widened. Chairman, we cannot hand this to him. We are not handing it to him, Arthur said. We are asking him to prove it. Naomi added. On record. Arthur nodded. On record. Daniel looked at the harbor map, at the Blue Vale property node, at the smooth projections built around an ugly assumption. He knew with a tired certainty that settled somewhere below anger that the divorce had not ended his connection to the Vale family. It had only removed the last reason to protect them from the truth. At that exact moment across town, Marissa Vale stood in her mother's kitchen watching a video her cousin had sent from the courthouse steps. The clip showed Daniel stepping into Arthur Whitmore's limousine while Clara Bennett held the door. Her father stood behind her, frozen on the screen with his mouth slightly open. Marissa replayed it once. Then again. Her phone rang. Richard Vale's name lit the screen. She answered, and before she could speak, her father said, "Where is Daniel?" Marissa stared at the paused image of her ex-husband disappearing into the billionaire's limo. "I don't know," she said. Richard's voice shook with the first real fear she had ever heard from him. Find out. Marissa Vale had spent 3 months preparing herself to feel free after the divorce. She had imagined leaving the courthouse lighter, cleaner, finally unburdened by the man she told herself had no ambition. She had imagined lunch with her mother, a call from her father, maybe a quiet glass of wine in the evening while she deleted Daniel's name from the household accounts and began the next version of her life. What she had not imagined was standing in her mother's marble kitchen watching a shaky phone video of her ex-husband stepping into Arthur Whitmore's limousine while the richest logistics chairman in the state apparently waited for him. Her father's voice stayed in her ear. Find out where he went. Marissa turned away from the screen. Dad, why? Richard Vale did not answer immediately, and that frightened her more than his anger would have. Richard always answered quickly when he was certain he controlled the room. Because Whitmore Transit is voting today on the harbor expansion package. Vale & Co. has the East Corridor property tied into that rollout. If Daniel is with Arthur Whitmore, I need to know whether this is personal or business. Marissa looked at the paused image again. Daniel's face was not visible. Just his back, his worn navy suit, and Clara Bennett holding the limo door like he was someone expected. Daniel never said he knew Arthur Whitmore. He worked there before you married him. He was an operations employee. Richard's voice hardened. Do not repeat things you do not understand. Call him. The line went dead. For a long moment, Marissa stood in the quiet kitchen with her phone in her hand and her divorce ring still on. She remembered Daniel coming home late in the second year of their marriage, smelling faintly of cold coffee and warehouse air. She remembered asking why he kept taking calls from dispatch managers if he was supposed to be on leave. He had said because if they miss this window, people lose jobs. She had told him he was not responsible for every truck in America. He had smiled tiredly and said nothing. That silence had infuriated her then. Now it felt like a locked door. She called him. Daniel did not answer. At Whitmore Tower, Daniel stood alone in a small glass conference room while the board took a recess. Rain streaked the windows beyond him, blurring the city into gray lines. On the table were printed route maps, port delay tables, driver hour grids, cold chain penalty clauses, and the one blue highlighted Vale & Co. property node that seemed to glow brighter every time he looked at it. His phone buzzed again. Marissa. Then a message. Daniel, we need to talk. Please. He set the phone face down. Clara Bennett entered with coffee he had not asked for. Your ex-wife has called the front desk twice. That was fast. Her father called legal once. Clara placed the cup beside him. He asked whether you were acting in an official capacity. Daniel almost laughed. I signed divorce papers 2 hours ago. I don't have an official capacity. Arthur intends to fix that. Daniel looked through the glass at the boardroom. Owen Pierce was talking to 2 directors, hands moving quickly, already trying to turn Daniel's warning into old resentment. Naomi Reed sat apart from them, reading the 2021 memo line by line. Arthur remained at the head of the table, still as a mountain before bad weather. I did not come back to become a weapon against my ex-wife's family, Daniel said. Clara studied him. Then don't. Become a witness against a bad assumption. Before Daniel could answer, Arthur opened the boardroom door. We reconvene in 10. Daniel picked up the coffee. I need the original property evaluation for the Vale site. Arthur's eyes narrowed. You think it is worse than the map shows. I think the map was cleaned. Arthur turned to Clara. Get him everything. By mid-afternoon, the emergency review had moved from private board session to a formal investor and operations hearing. Whitmore Transit did not call it public, but there were too many people in the room for secrecy. Senior lenders joined by video. A labor representative sat near the back. 2 Port Authority observers were present. The board took their seats under a large screen showing the harbor expansion timeline. Vale & Co. was represented by Richard Vale himself, looking polished but pale, with Marissa beside him in the same cream coat she had worn at the courthouse. She had changed nothing about her appearance, yet everything about her looked less certain. Daniel entered with Arthur and Clara. Marissa stood halfway, then stopped when Daniel did not look at her first. Richard leaned toward her. Do not make this emotional, she whispered. You told me to call him. I told you to control the situation. Daniel heard neither sentence clearly, but he saw enough. He took his place at the side table, not at the head, not beside Arthur, but near the route display where facts mattered more than chairs. Owen Pierce began with confidence. The harbor expansion is critical to Whitmore's next phase. The Vale East Corridor site gives us proximity, cost efficiency, and tax advantages. The automated routing rollout has been tested extensively. The concerns raised this morning come from an outdated 2021 memo written before our current system architecture existed. He clicked the remote. A clean graph appeared. Revenue climb. Delay reduction. Margin improvement. Smooth lines rising like promises. Owen continued, we should not delay a $400 million opportunity because a former employee is attached to manual processes that modern logistics has outgrown. Several investors nodded. Richard Vale relaxed by 1 inch. Arthur looked at Daniel. Mr. West. Daniel stood slowly. He did not touch the remote at first. The problem with a clean graph is that it only shows what you allowed into it. Owen smiled. We allowed 18 months of operating data. Daniel walked to the screen and pulled up a second file Clara had provided, and excluded 6 categories as outliers: port slowdown weeks, flood detour weeks, driver shortage periods, strike advisory days, refrigerated cargo surges, and temporary warehouse overflow events. Owen's smile thinned. Those conditions distort the baseline. Yes, Daniel said. Because the real world distorts baselines. A murmur moved across the room. Daniel changed the display. The beautiful graph vanished, replaced by a layered map of the East Harbor Corridor. I am not here to tell you the harbor expansion is impossible. It is possible, but not with a single site dependency at the Vale property and not with the local override layer removed. The current system assumes that when delay happens, routing can simply adapt. But the system has no legal hours to create, no cold dock capacity to invent, and no backup staging lane once all refrigerated freight is pointed into this corridor. He marked 3 pressure points in red: port delay, driver hour compression, cold chain stacking. Separately, the model survives. Together, it fails. Owen crossed his arms. You are describing an extreme convergence. Daniel looked at the Port Authority observer. How many times did East Harbor operations hit 2 of those 3 conditions last winter? The observer checked his notes. 7. And all 3. The man hesitated. Twice. Daniel turned back to the room. Twice, in 1 season, is not extreme. It is inconvenient. And the model was built to hide inconvenience. Richard Vale leaned forward. With respect, Mr. West, you are turning operational caution into an attack on a property deal. The Vale site is shovel-ready. It brings jobs. It brings tax revenue. And frankly, given your personal history with my family, your neutrality is questionable. There it was. The bridge between courthouse insult and boardroom pressure. Marissa looked down at the table. Daniel faced Richard. You are right about one thing. I am not neutral about your family. The room tightened. Daniel continued. I gave your company money when you were 3 days from payroll collapse. I kept your debt quiet when disclosure would have cost Marissa her position. I left Whitmore full-time because your daughter needed help and because your family said privacy mattered more than credit. So no, I am not neutral. I am informed. Marissa's face changed as if the floor had dropped beneath a memory. She looked at Richard. What money? Richard did not answer. Daniel went on before the personal moment could swallow the room. But none of that changes the math. If the Vale site worked, I would say it worked. It does not work as the sole cold chain staging node under this rollout. And if Whitmore signs this approval today with the current assumptions, the company will be lying to itself. Owen stepped in. You keep saying lying. That is reckless. Daniel turned to him. Then, let's use your word. Optimized. Your team optimized out the safeguards that made the model honest. Naomi Reed looked up. Do we have documentation of who requested the outlier exclusions? Clara placed a folder in front of Arthur. Arthur opened it, read once, and his jaw tightened. Owen said data cleanup was part of the modernization process. Naomi's voice cut through the room. Who requested it? The analyst from earlier, seated near the wall, looked like he wanted to disappear, Arthur noticed. Mr. Kim. The analyst swallowed. The request came from Mr. Pierce's rollout office. We were told the board needed a cleaner investor model. Owen snapped, that is not what I said. Daniel looked at the screen. It does not matter what you said in a hallway. It matters what the model does when trucks hit the road. Arthur leaned forward. Daniel, if we pause the rollout, what is the alternative? Restore local dispatch override. Use two-site staging instead of the Vale single-node dependency. Reinsert the excluded stress periods and rerun the model. Delay approval until the board sees failure conditions, not just average conditions. How long? 10 days for a real first review, 30 for clean implementation. Owen laughed sharply. 30 days kills the expansion window. Daniel looked at him. Approving today kills more than a window. Arthur lifted one document from the folder and slid it across the table. There is a provisional approval statement prepared for today. Owen was going to have operations leadership sign it before the investor call. Daniel, I want your answer on record. If we appoint you temporary independent operations reviewer, will you sign confidence in the current rollout? The room turned toward him. Marissa looked up slowly. Richard's fingers tightened around his pen. Owen's expression held fury behind a corporate mask. The document stopped in front of Daniel's signature line blank. For 7 years, Daniel had signed things to keep peace, hospital forms, loan transfers, consulting withdrawals, tax documents, quiet agreements that protected other people from embarrassment while making him look smaller. He looked at the pen beside the document and thought of the courthouse that morning, of Marissa asking him to say something only after the papers were done. He thought of his wedding ring in his pocket and the old keycard on the boardroom table. Then he pushed the document back unsigned. No, Arthur did not blink. State why. I will not sign confidence in a model that fails under predictable road conditions. I will help fix it. I will put my name on the corrected system, but I will not let a clean graph rename a bad risk. The room went silent. This silence was different from the courthouse steps where everyone had been shocked by a limousine. This silence came from recognition. The board understood that the man Marissa had left as a nobody was now the only person in the room willing to attach his name to the truth instead of the deal. Arthur turned to the board. Then the harbor expansion approval is paused. The Vale & Co. single-site contract is suspended pending conflict and operational review. Owen Pierce is removed from rollout authority, effective immediately. Daniel West will serve as emergency independent operations lead under written agreement with liability protection, direct board access, and authority to restore safeguards before any renewed vote. Owen stood. Arthur, this is insane. Arthur's voice hardened. No, Owen. Insane was removing the brakes and calling the vehicle faster. Naomi seconded the motion. One by one, the board approved. Richard Vale pushed back from the table. You cannot suspend our contract based on one man's personal grudge. Daniel looked at him, calm at last. You are not losing the contract because of my divorce. You are losing it because the road does not care who your daughter married. Marissa flinched, but Daniel's voice held no cruelty. That made it worse. He was not trying to wound her. He was simply no longer shielding her. The meeting broke apart into emergency calls, investor briefings, and legal instructions. Owen left with Clara escorting him toward a side office where security would collect company devices. Richard Vale moved quickly to the hallway, already calling counsel. Celeste, who had arrived halfway through and watched from the back, stood frozen near the glass doors with the stunned expression of a woman who had spent the morning laughing at a man she now needed. Marissa stayed in her chair. Daniel gathered the old red flag memo, the Vale property map, and the unsigned confidence statement. Arthur approached with a contract folder. Written terms, Arthur said. No handshake nonsense. Emergency authority. Equity restoration discussions after the first 30 days. You can have outside counsel review before signing. Daniel took the folder. Good. Arthur looked at him for a moment. You know I did not send the limo to rescue you. I know. I sent it because I needed the man who still knew where the brakes were. Daniel glanced toward Marissa. Funny day for brakes. Arthur's expression softened, but only slightly. Do not let the people who misread your silence decide what it meant. By the time Daniel left the board floor, evening had darkened the city. He expected to find Clara. Instead, Marissa waited near the private elevator, no mother, no father, no lawyer beside her. For the first time all day, she looked like someone without an audience. Daniel, she said. He stopped, leaving enough space between them to make clear that history was not an invitation. I didn't know, she said. He held the contract folder at his side. About which part? Her eyes filled, though she fought it. The money. My father. Whitmore. What you gave up. Daniel looked toward the window where the city lights reflected like broken lines. You knew I was tired. You knew I stayed. You knew I sold pieces of myself quietly. You just did not know the price was high enough to respect. She looked down. That is not fair. No, he said gently. It is accurate. Marissa pressed her lips together. I was ashamed. Not of you at first, of needing you. Then later, when you didn't become the man I thought people would admire, I let my family tell me you had become small. Daniel listened without rescuing her from the words. I am sorry, she said. For today. For the courthouse. For letting my mother. For 7 years, he said. She closed her eyes. I was never asking you to admire me, Daniel said. I was asking you to see me. A tear slipped down her cheek. Is there any part of us that can be fixed? Daniel thought of the conference room, the signed papers, the ring in his pocket, the limo door closing the boardroom, going silent when the truth finally stood without apology. He did not hate her. That surprised him. But love, he realized, could end before kindness did. I hope you become someone who does not need a man to arrive in a billionaire's limo before you wonder what he is worth, he said. She covered her mouth with one hand. Daniel stepped into the elevator. Daniel, she whispered. He looked at her one last time. Take care of yourself, Marissa. The doors closed. 3 days later, the story had become public in the careful way corporate truth becomes public. Whitmore Transit announced a pause in the harbor expansion rollout due to operational review. Vale & Co. East Corridor contract was suspended pending revised site analysis. Owen Pierce resigned from executive duties, though the press release used softer words. Investors grumbled, then steadied. When Arthur Whitmore personally backed Daniel's review plan. The first corrected model showed exactly what Daniel had warned. Under convergence conditions, the Vale single-site strategy would have triggered missed delivery windows, cold chain penalties, driver violations, and contract exposure, large enough to erase the projected profit. Arthur did not gloat. Daniel did not either. On the 5th morning, Daniel stood in the Whitmore operations floor before sunrise, wearing the same old keycard on a new temporary badge. Dispatch managers were already arguing over restored local override protocols. Analysts were reloading excluded stress periods. A whiteboard showed 3 words Daniel had written at the top. Roads are real. Clara walked in with the finalized agreement. Board approved emergency authority through the review period. Acting operations lead. Direct reporting to Arthur and Naomi. Full liability protection. Daniel signed after reading every line. Not quickly. Not dramatically. Carefully. When he left Whitmore Tower that morning, the black limo waited by the curb. So did his old pickup, brought over from the courthouse parking lot by a Whitmore driver after Clara noticed he had never retrieved it. The truck sat under the glass tower with its dented fender-chipped paint and toolbox in the bed, looking stubbornly out of place among the polished cars. Clara stood beside the limo. Chairman said you can use the car as long as you need. Daniel looked at the limo, then at the truck. Tell Arthur I appreciate it. You're taking the truck. I am. Any reason. Daniel touched the old ring in his pocket, then looked at the pickup that had carried groceries, hospital bags, late-night toolboxes, consulting binders, and a marriage that had ended in a room too bright for grief. Because it never pretended to be more than it was. Clara smiled faintly. He will like that answer. Daniel opened the truck door. Before getting in, he looked back at Whitmore Tower. 5 days earlier, he had walked out of a courthouse with divorce papers, and no words left for people determined not to hear them. Minutes later, a billionaire's limo had pulled up, not to make him rich, not to make his ex-wife jealous, not to turn pain into spectacle, but to return him to a room where truth still had use for him. He was still divorced, still tired, still a man with a dented truck and a ring he had not yet decided what to do with. But he was no longer standing outside someone else's judgment, waiting to be measured by people who confused quiet with empty. That evening he drove past the courthouse without stopping. Rain had washed the steps clean. The curb where the limo had pulled up was empty. Daniel kept going. There would be meetings tomorrow. Models to rebuild, contracts to review, people to disappoint with facts. Maybe in time, a life that did not require him to prove his worth to be treated gently. At a red light, he took the wedding ring from his pocket and placed it in the ashtray, not thrown away, not worn, simply set down. Some things did not need to be destroyed to be finished. When the light turned green, Daniel drove toward the harbor where trucks moved under gray morning clouds and real roads waited for honest maps.